on where we are in terms of the activity that we discussed doing over a working lunch. There was such good discussion during lunch, I didn't want to interrupt that. What we'll do at 4 o'clock as the final portion of today is go over the athlete report and the structure of that report and an example of that, what we introduced yesterday, just to put a little bit of tangible discussion around that. And then tomorrow we'll find time to come back to these key issues that were identified earlier this morning. So if everyone's good with that, we'll go with that plan. And I'll just introduce Jasmine to make introductions for our special guests. Thanks.
Hello, and welcome back for lunch. Did everyone have a good lunch? Yep. Yay, good. Well, we've got a really great afternoon planned. I'm really looking forward to this session. How this session came to be was a couple of months back. If you recall, there was a lot of news going on around in July about changes in legislation in Russia and the Sochi Games. And so, at AthletesCAN, we started to think about it and go, how does this impact our athletes, and what should our athletes be prepared for when they go? And so I turned to Jen, who you'll meet in a few minutes, and our partners at Cause, and said, is there anyone talking about this in the sport community? What's happening at the COC? What's happening at the CPC? Started reaching out at the national level to have a broader discussion about the impacts, because certainly we want to make sure that our teams heading to Russia in 2014 are as informed and prepared as possible to have the best performance as possible. But at the same time, it gives us a really neat opportunity to look domestically at the type of environment we provide as a sport community for ourselves, for our athletes, for our coaches, for anyone engaging in sport, and ensuring that we have a welcoming environment for anyone who's participating in sport or physical activity. So, which leads us to this opportunity today to talk about just that. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to the folks sitting at the front here. We have Dr. Lindsay Alcock.
Hello. Thank you.
Lindsay is a two-time Canadian Olympian in skeleton, competing in 2002 Salt Lake City, Utah, 2006 in Torino, Italy, and in 2004 she held the overall Women's World Cup title. She's a chiropractor and a motivational speaker in Calgary, Alberta. We have Chris Burley. Chris is a '96 Olympian and former Canadian champion in artistic gymnastics. He was the vice chair of AthletesCAN from '97 to 2001 before running off to tour with Cirque du Soleil. Chris is a former board member for Commonwealth Games Canada, New Brunswick Gymnastics, and COC Athletes Council member, and he's currently an independent producer in Toronto. We have Bruce Kidd. Bruce is a '64 Olympian, professor of kinesiology and physical education, and warden of Hart House at the University of Toronto. He's a lifelong advocate of human rights and athlete rights in sport. And we have Jennifer Birch-Jones. Jennifer is a professional facilitator, practitioner, and educator, specializing in planning, measurement, and evaluation, and has an extensive background in sport. She serves as a volunteer program lead for the Canadian Association for the Advancement of Women in Sport and Physical Activity, Addressing Homophobia in Sport initiative. In partnership with AthletesCAN and Coaches of Canada, she's currently working with the National Advisory Group of Athletes and Coaches to create a resource on making sport more welcoming to sexual and gender diversity. So it's my pleasure at this time to pass the mic over to Jen, who will facilitate the afternoon session.
Thank you, Jasmine, very much, and on behalf of all of us here. This is a panel, but it's set up as a panel, but it's a conversation, because we want this very much to be a conversation, and not only a conversation between the four of us, but a conversation in the larger room, because it's not a topic that we often get to speak about. And so when we wanted to have this session and use Sochi as a platform, we thought what an excellent opportunity for each of us to have conversations with the larger group, but also in the smaller group. So we'll have that. We've got it broken up into two parts where there'll be us sharing our thoughts and views and insights, and then also asking you for yours and having opportunities at the table to discuss amongst yourselves, because it's all about athlete leadership and taking action. And so what we want to do is for responsible athlete leadership to happen, you need education. So we're going to spend a little bit of time educating and talking about some of the issues around making sport more welcoming to sexual orientation and gender diversity. And then we're going to talk about some actions that are being taken. We'll talk about Sochi, but we'll also talk about longer-term change in sport and the role, most importantly, that athletes and organizations like AthletesCAN can play. So let's get started. I am absolutely delighted to say we have 2 out gay Olympians. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there are not that many out gay Olympians. And so for their courage, I would like to publicly acknowledge and thank them for coming today and speaking as out gay Olympians. And I'm going to use an acronym here today, LGBTIQ. And I'm going to explain what that is and then just use it, and you'll become more familiar with it. And most of you probably have heard it before in some variation. So the L stands for lesbian, which is women who are primarily attracted to other women, sexually, emotionally, and physically. And G stands for gay, and gay can represent all those of us who are homosexual, but also specifically gay men. So L, G, B comes next. I feel like Sesame Street, LGB. So B is for bisexual, but it's important that we feel comfortable with the language. So B for bisexual, who that individual likes both sexes. As a friend of mine who's bisexual says, I get 100% of the population to choose from, so rather than just 50%. So LGB. Now the T can stand for a number of things, so it's really important that we recognize that different cultures have different words. And so our Aboriginal culture is very important to us in Canada, and so the Aboriginal culture uses the term two-spirited to represent those of us who love both our own genders, their sex. So two-spirited, and also the T can stand for transgendered. So, and we'll be talking about some of the issues around transgendered. I is new to some people, intersex, and Bruce is going to talk a little bit about that, but probably the most well-known case of intersex athletes at the Olympic level is Caster Semenya. And so those of you who know that story and the tragedy around that and the horrific way it was dealt with, know that we have some work to do there. And then the last one is Q, and Q is kind of a catch-all, and it's a term that used to be negative, but it now is being reclaimed by our community as a positive. And it's a term we hear more and more youth using. So I'm from an older generation, and so in my generation, queer was a derogatory thing, but it's being used more by the community. So enough about acronyms, but I think it's important to start with language because language is really powerful and part of the education. So LGBTIQ, if you start practicing it, it rhymes off really quickly. So, so what I'd like to do is I'm going to start and we're going to have a conversation here, and I'm going to talk to Lindsay and Chris first a little bit about the LGB issues, because LGBTQ issues, and a lot of the LGBTQ issues are common when we're talking about respect and we're talking about differences, but there are some unique aspects to the transgender and intersex issue, and so I'm going to bring Bruce into the conversation a few minutes later, but I'm going to focus a little bit on Chris and Lindsay to start. So maybe we've come a long way in the last number of years, and usually through the actions of courageous individuals, and I would suggest not so much collective organizational action, but that's where action takes place in terms of it starts with one person. So maybe I'll turn to Lindsay and talk to you a little bit, because
Sure.
and share a little bit about your coming out story as an athlete who then was competing and actively competing, and who came out to her teammates.
So back in 2000, I actually met another woman on the tour, on the skeleton tour, from the US, and I hadn't quite come out to myself, let alone to my family or friends. And then into the 2001 season, as I started to date this person on the US team, I realized who I was. I knew that I was lesbian and started to tell some of my very close teammates. And by the time I got into the 2002 season, qualified for Salt Lake City, I was very much at peace with it and felt that I had the full support of my coaches, my teammates, and my family, and I could really compete without any of that baggage, and it was quite a freeing feeling to have.
And I know when we spoke about your story, you said that at that point when you were able to be out and true to yourself, your performance took off.
It really did. I had a string of years between 2002 and 2004 where I felt like I couldn't do anything wrong. It just was amazing. I felt like I was in an entirely different zone. And that was a very, very neat feeling. There was definitely hesitation of when to come out because I was in the background when I was still in the development stage. I knew of one out athlete on the entire tour, men and women. And she was also from the US, another athlete, not the one I was dating, but she was very masculine looking. And she had a lot of negative feedback that I could hear, a lot of chatter in the background. And so I wouldn't comment to it because I wasn't even sure about myself at the time, but I knew that I would have to be prepared for that kind of feedback too. And one thing we'll probably get to later is this whole idea of if I don't look like that, do I somehow get a pass? You know, and I almost felt like I was letting that athlete down when I did come out because I didn't actually get that negative feedback. And I don't know if it was because things had changed within a few years or because I looked a little more feminine. Perhaps I was not targeted. And I feel to this day really bad about that.
Well, we're going to talk about the stigma. It manifests itself differently for gay men and gay women in sports, but we're going to talk about that stigma associated with being gay. And unfortunately, it's not a positive stigma yet. I'm hoping we're going to turn it around and be a positive stigma, but right now it's a negative one. So, and it affects athletes who are gay and lesbian, but it also affects those who are heterosexual, who are accused or thought of, and then they start feeling negative and get defensive, and so you get into a vicious circle of negative stuff, and we want to turn it around and make it a positive thing, because it's all about respecting differences and valuing that. So thank you for sharing that, Lindsay, and we're going to come back to that. Now, Chris, we know that homophobia plays out differently for men and women, and in sport in particular. Maybe talk a little bit about your experience.
Well, I would argue it kind of does a little bit. I mean, I think the conditions are a little bit different between a lesbian athlete or a gay athlete, but I mean, we can talk about that later. I didn't come out until, I come from gymnastics, which is a very judged sport, and anybody that knows about judged sports will know that every little bit of what you do is judged, evaluated. But I didn't come out until about 3 or 4 years after I retired. I had a similar experience to you in that when I was going through that questioning phase while I was still an active athlete, I didn't feel comfortable talking to teammates about it. I also didn't feel like relationships weren't my number one priority, the Olympics were. So I was focused on getting rid of anything that was distracting, including relationships. But in 1996, the Olympics I went to, the Olympic champion on floor exercise was, I can't even say his name, Ioannidis. Anyway, he was a Greek athlete, won the gold medal on floor exercise, blew everybody away, came out of nowhere. But what happened to him was he became the only out gymnast on the international circuit. And he was very, we'd say very gay, but
we can say that.
He was much more feminine, right? And after he won the gold medal, he sort of came into his own. He started dressing differently, a little bit more radically. And it really pissed off the Russians and the Chinese and everybody else. And so all of a sudden, after the 96 Olympics, after he won the gold medal, he never won another world medal or Olympic medal. He was ostracized. The athletes wouldn't talk to him. The coaches wouldn't talk to him. And I saw this from the sideline, even though I was going through my own sort of questioning phase. And I realized I do not want to be that athlete, right? I do not want to be, because he was treated horribly. And it wasn't until I came out, it wasn't until I retired and I moved to Toronto and I was working with television and film that I was actually in a sort of a judgment-free environment with another former Olympic athlete who I was living with, and said, you know, date anybody who you want, and there was no judgment, so I came out at that point.
And Chris, I'm going to ask you about this, and also Lindsay, but so fast forward now, you're both still involved very much in sport, and so looking around and seeing what you see in sport, what do you see as sort of, you know, a couple of the key issues that we still have to face and address to make sport more welcoming to those of us who are gay?
I personally think there's, for men, there's this issue of masculinity and what the archetype of masculinity is for a male athlete. I know that figure skaters and gymnasts and sometimes divers and some other athletes get sort of stereotyped as being gay, depending on the sport that they do. I think dancers also actually experience that. If you're a male dancer, you get the same sort of stereotype. And the idea of masculinity is quite fluid. And I think that when we look at an athlete and their performance, our preconceptions, especially in North America, we have different preconceptions on what masculinity is. And I think that that sort of affects people's opinion on athletes in general, but particularly gay athletes.
Lindsay?
I'm definitely seeing some great changes since I've been retired for 5 years now, and I know that it's a little more of a welcoming environment. However, I believe that there's still some barrier for athletes to come out because of sponsors. I really believe that it's still there today, that they're afraid they're going to lose a sponsorship if they come out. And I was at the Pride Parade in Calgary, and the Canadian Olympic Committee entered in. We had a group of athletes marching. And for Calgary being such a hub for sport, for Olympic sport, I was actually quite surprised how few athletes marched, even gay allies. We maybe had a contingent of 6 or 7. Very, very small amount. And I think it's because we're going into the Olympic year for Sochi, and it's too precarious for a lot of athletes to mess with their current platform and what they've built to this point in that cycle. They just don't want to mess with it. And that's just my personal impression. Sam, you were in the march, and you know, great to have allies out there. But we can do so much better. Yeah.
And Lindsay used a term that you'll hear a lot, allies, because that's part of the process of affecting change. And you can have allies on any particular issue, but for us, allies are in the LGBT community, and the fight for equality and equal rights has to do with usually heterosexual allies who are able to speak out and in support of a particular issue, in this particular case, equality for gays and lesbians. So the importance of allies is huge. So I'm going to bring, I'm going to just add to something that Lindsay talked about. She was relatively young, and she wasn't sure what impact that was going to have on her in terms of the coaches, and it was a really positive thing. Some of the work that I'm doing right now is interviewing athletes for this coaching resource, and what the athletes are saying is, you know what, attitudes are changing. This generation and generations that are going to come behind are more accepting of sexual diversity. And but you know what? We've got a whole generation of coaches that are older that may not be as accepting, and they are in positions of power. And so, you know, one story about an athlete a female athlete, a heterosexual, has a friend on one of the winter teams and who's trying to qualify for Sochi, and he's gay, and he's terrified that his coach will find out, because he believes that if his coach finds out, the coach is older school, not from Canada originally, he will not be selected for Sochi. But she's of the view as a friend that his anxiety around being outed and being found out is affecting his chances for Sochi. Because there's a ton of, all the athletes we talk to that say there's just so much negative energy around hiding around your true self. And so when, you know, Lindsay talks about being able to come out, Mark Tewksbury coming out the night before. So it's just a really positive, liberating, freeing thing if you're able to be out. I'm going to bring my dear friend and colleague Bruce Kidd into this conversation, because Bruce is a passionate advocate not only for LGBT, but the T and the I as well. And so I've asked Bruce to do a monumental task and sort of introduce us to some of the issues around transgender and intersex in sport in a very short amount of time. So Bruce, you know, in terms of the commonality or common issues, around those who are transgendered and intersex in sport?
Well, I think there's similarity in that just as LGBTQ have been persecuted or discriminated against or marginalized because of who they are, so are intersex athletes, humans of ambiguous or complicated sexuality, who are raised as one gender or the other, are recognized in their communities as being of one gender or another, and certainly see themselves as one gender or another, but because of their looks are marginalized or discriminated against. And that whole category of humans are known as intersex athletes. There's a moral panic, I would say, in the sports world about a number of these athletes. Caster Semenya is a good example. She came out of nowhere, as it were, from South Africa to win the 2009 World Championships in the 800 meters in track and field. And instead of saying, what a brilliant new world champion in our sport, huge failure of leadership there. There was this moral panic that maybe she's not really a woman, maybe she's a guy, maybe she's hermaphrodite with advantages, and the IAAF and the IOC initiated a new gender verification test known as the gender hyperandrogenism test to vet all outstanding female athletes of I would say exceptional athletic ability, although the excuse is that they may be intersex. There is no scientific evidence that any of these women have a particular athletic advantage, any different than the athletic advantages that different genetic makeup, different parental background, different society membership presents. What we need to do is to recognize every human's right to gender self-identification as a basic human right. If you can't yourself identify who you are in gender terms, human rights amount to nothing. And secondly, we must call upon the sports movement, and particularly the Olympic movement, to be true to our ambition to include and to respect all humanity, to celebrate all humanity despite our diversity, and take the leadership in that regard, and stand up for our intersex fellow athletes and publicly admire them. I'm pleased to say there's leadership on this front in Canada. The Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, one of your sponsors, convened an expert panel from the academic and sports communities last year. And that panel, in a report that I believe has been now posted on your website, calls for the elimination of the new gender hyperandrogenism test. It argues that this is a scientifically bogus initiative and ought to be expelled or eliminated as soon as possible. And the spirit of that report is to call for Canada to be a test-free zone and to take the leadership internationally at ending this other form of discrimination. As someone who's been involved in the struggle for genuine equality in sport all my life, one of the rules of thumb that I learned early on was that if you believe that getting things done means one thing at a time, and you look at all forms of discrimination out there, the best place to start is to look at the most marginalized or the most discriminated against and help those people. And if you do that other people who are, and I hate to put this in hierarchical terms, slightly less oppressed will generally benefit from the broadest possible application of the call for equity. And I believe, therefore, that right now in the sports world, the demonization of women like Caster Semenya and others like her, their persecution is the worst form of discrimination in sport today. And if we are going to be true to the values of Olympic sport, of Canadian sport, we should reach out, embrace, and include them, and fight against their oppressors, which sadly, at the moment, includes the International Olympic Committee.
Well, and I think, thank you, Bruce, and I think also one of the areas that's really common across this issue of LGBTIQ in sport is that there is a lot of misinformation out there. And so if we can leave you with one thing going away is to educate yourselves. You know, if you have a position and what you've learned this afternoon or this weekend challenges that a little bit, educate yourself some more, read some more, because, you know, people automatically go to the level playing field and assumptions about, you know, males being better than females and, you know, how does that all play out, et cetera, and, you know, more masculine. No one's worried about women transitioning to men playing sport, but there's, you know, everybody's concerned about men transitioning to women. And I'm not suggesting we don't need to have, you know, guidance around that and a way to do that, but we need to, I think, challenge some of our assumptions around that. And so education around, whether it's around being more inclusive to lesbian and gays or transgender and intersex, it all comes from a common sort of desire to make a difference and treat people with respect. So we've talked a little bit about some of the issues. We've touched on the fact that it plays out differently for men and women. It's based on quite often a lot of misinformation. There's fear on the part of the athletes. They're not in a position of power to be able to address that. It's not often spoken about, and sometimes athletes hear language. That's the other thing we hear is we need to clean up the language. You know, that's really, really important. And we need to use language that's inclusive. So I'll give you an example of, when we talk to athletes, say, you know, and anyone who's LGBTQ, they'll navigate. So they'll be having a conversation, they'll be making a decision about how out they can be, and they'll be looking for signals, visible signals that, you know, who they're talking to, you know, is going to be okay with this. So imagine this with a sponsor. So one of the Olympic athletes that was in Whistler, in Vancouver, Whistler, is getting ready for Sochi. And so she's meeting a new sponsor, and this is how her sponsor asked her a personal question. Do you have a special guy or girl in your life? Whoa. She knew from that particular point she could talk about a girlfriend. Now, that's the kind of signals that the LGBTIQ are looking at, and so when we talk about it afterwards, things that can be done, we'll talk about visibility. And so, but that's inclusive language, and then the casual homophobic kind of language that we hear a lot of on the sport field to motivate. Quite often it's homophobic and sexist, so it's usually questioning masculinity, right? You know, and so if you look at a lot of the words that are being used out there, they're attacking the maleness of an individual, or they're attacking the femaleness of a male and the maleness of a female. And so we need to take a really good look at that. So the good news is we're talking about that. So what we want to do for the next 10 minutes is have you talk at your table about what you're hearing up here, and is it what exists in your sport? You know, are the issues different? There's no right or wrong answer. It's just a question for you to do that. So you've got your buddies at your table that are going to lead you through a conversation just to talk about, are these some of the issues that are happening in your sport? And to talk about that. And then we'll come back and do a little sharing. So off you go. Okay. I'm going to ask you to, I don't have that, shh. And again, I don't want to be like a shush like a teacher, but like one of those rainbow cloud things. So rainbow sticks, water sticks. As a facilitator, it's wonderful when you put a group to a task and the conversations start right away. So what I'd like to do is we're not going to have a time to share with everybody in terms of the conversations you've had, but what we have is we have your buddy leaders at each of the tables. They're going to be taking notes during the conversations, and that information is going to be passed on back to AthletesCAN, and we're going to look at that in terms of not only the first part of the conversation about the issues, but also about, if I can ask for just one conversation, gang? Woohoo! Thank you. I'm competing with the other guys too, but and then the second part also what action. So what we're just going to do now is I'm going to ask for a volunteer from one of the tables, one of the buddies, just to talk a little bit in terms of the highlights of your conversation. Was it, was what you were hearing up here kind of what you're hearing in amongst the table mates? And if not, what was different? What are the experiences going on at the table? Got a volunteer? Tom. I'm going to get you over here.
Oh, well, I have to do my pants up, though. No, I'm not joking.
Okay. Okay.
Hey, it's a lot of sitting down, right? I'm not an athlete anymore either, and I got to fit into these. I think the main thing that came out of it were it's a very different sports at our table, and everyone had a similar take on that. Seemed like it was more prevalent for women to be out than men, and that was the one thing that kind of went around the whole thing. Except in paddling, where there's 2 guys who are out that we know of, and no women that we know of. So, but the other sports are definitely more women than men. So, yeah.
Thank you. Another table, another volunteer.
We just had a reflection that, in certain sports, like water polo, for example, where we have a few girls in our sport that have come out, and there are some particular girls that are really, really talented, and they're really excellent. And because of their excellence, acceptance has just been much more easily given. And so in our sport, it's just really accepted, and it's no problem at all. So excellence really breaks barriers.
And we're going to talk a little bit about that link to performance after in the next half. Another table. Lori.
One of the other comments very consistent with others. One comment that came up was that in general, for the women who were out, that other women didn't feel threatened at all by the expression of one's sexual orientation, but that in the case of a man who was out, either they were not able to be fully out, so kind of negotiating that, and that men may be more threatened by their expression of their sexual orientation, just by their actions or labeling things.
Yeah, and one of the things we find too with not in all cases, but with women being out, it's sort of, well, it's okay to be out in the locker room. Sometimes there's conditions put on that, but we don't want to be known as a lesbian team. So outside of that locker room, there are some conditions that go on. So. Don't get me wrong, it's way better. So, and we're seeing way more acceptance. Okay, one more table, and then we'll. I
don't want to go after Lori. Lori pretty much summed up. Sorry, Ryan, life saving. She summed up what we touched on with water polo, the animosity they would feel, and Drake was actually talking about, like, if you wanted to come out, you would have to consider a career change in sport because you couldn't understand how to bear that. We also sort of deviated in discussion because I got to get a fresh topic from Lori about status quo. I've never experienced any problems in my sport. And while you guys were speaking, my meeting would be like, "Oh, we're so good. We don't have any problems." And then it was kind of like, "Oh, wait, maybe there's just bad stigma. Nobody wants to rock that boat." I never thought about that because I don't come from a sport that is in the Olympics. We don't need to worry about the sponsorships. It never occurred to me. But so I'll have more questions on that for you guys after, because I'm sure you're going to get there.
Excellent. Thank you. So we were listening and really, really good conversations. We're not going to do this justice in 90 minutes, and that's why there's a Dropbox folder with some good resources that you'll be able to go to and look at some more. But, I mean, we're all here as athletes. One of the things that I want to sort of note is, and this is an AthletesCAN forum, but we're also doing work with Coaches of Canada, because how many out coaches are there? There's a lot of coaches in the closet. And because of the fear around parents sending their athletes to a gay coach, parents sending their athlete to a program at university where there's a gay coach, the employers maybe not being comfortable with it, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some work we need to do with coaches as well around creating welcoming environments. I'm going to ask the panelists to come on back up, and we're going to talk a little bit about the link between performance and identity. And not just for those of us who are LGBTQ, but also the impact it has on the teammates who are not LGBTQ, because that's an important sort of consideration. So I'm going to ask Chris to talk a little bit and lead that conversation off.
We were talking up here, and one of the interesting things for me is the reason that this affects, I feel, that affects all athletes is because sexual orientation is part of your identity as a person, and I believe that the stronger your identity and the more able you are to be able to be yourself, your higher your level of performance. That's why I liked your story before when you were saying that when you finally came to grips with it and you were comfortable, your level of performance increases. There's research that demonstrates that. And that's why I think for any athlete, sexual orientation is only a part of your identity. Could be your cultural background, it could be your height, it could be your ethnicity. Any of those things are relevant to your identity, and all of those and your identity, I believe, is relevant to your performance. For me, I spent a lot of time and energy in trying not to be too gay when it came to my national team because they weren't open and accepting. My coach was 65 years old, he was a Russian guy, was 30 years on the Russian Soviet system. Not exactly the most open of kind of guys. And in particular, the sport of gymnastics, it's kind of like diving or whatever. We wear very little, like you're running around in shorts all day, that's it. And the feedback I got, even before I came out, was, you know, don't look at me, don't hit on me, and then I get the jokes, right? And I'm like, the last thing I want to do in a 5-hour training is to be staring at my teammates. And there's some misconceptions around that I think we're going to deal with later, but I think fundamentally that the reason that this issue particularly affects all athletes is because the ability for an athlete to be who they are is the opportunity to be as successful as they can be. So the greater that we allow athletes to be themselves, the greater that our performance. And that's what separates it too from coaches, I think, in many ways. And that's why athletes are unique in this position.
Well, and when we talk about the importance of team, even if you're in an individual sport, I mean, Lindsay, you can speak to this in terms of having the support of your teammates, because you're training together. So we think of teams as hockey teams, soccer teams, other kinds of teams, but there's a team environment there that facilitates performance, even if you're an individual sport.
Absolutely, and our team, we became a family, and we would always have our meals together at the table. And there were times where I did feel a little bit alone, in that I didn't feel like on tour when we're gone for 8 weeks. I didn't feel like I had any community. There really weren't too many people I could talk to other than my family. And so at the table, we would talk about our significant others, but I usually didn't get a lot of questions asked because it's an uncomfortable thing. They're maybe not sure how do you properly word it. If you even just by having your inclusive language, saying, well, what does your partner do? What things do you like to do? What sort of hobbies do you have? Just to be able to have that discussion so you can talk about your loved one as well. That goes a long way. And the other thing I was mentioning, Jeff Payne, my teammate over there, we were talking at the table about a moment when I really felt my team was supporting me. They were true allies. And we were in Montreal. We had a little bit of time off. And the team agreed to drive through the gay district of Montreal. And it was literally just a 5-minute drive. But, Chris, you can understand, huge. They did it for me. And it was only because for a split second I wanted to feel like I was in the majority for once. And that was huge. And that was years ago, and I still remember how impactful that was. And thank you to Jeff and to the rest of the team. Huge. Yeah.
I wanted to mention something about the table back there that said that, oh, there's no problems in my sport. I would sort of argue that in many cases people thought, in many sports we just don't know, because athletes are so often feeling like they're in the closet, that they're not able to come out for various reasons, that I think the issue of Sochi and a lot of that is going to lead to a lot of people becoming a little more vocal. But I think this issue is probably prevalent in sports, and I bet you there's a lot of teammates and members of sports that just are not comfortable at the level of coming out to be able to do that. So I think it does affect everyone.
And that's the other thing that I want to pick up on, because when I give workshops to the sport leaders and the coaches and I say, just assume that there are people who are heterosexual and non-heterosexual on your team. Don't look for them, just assume that. So, use the language. And even if they're not there, they probably have a mom or a dad or a brother or a sister or a family member or a close friend who's probably identifies as LGBTIQ. And so now you're getting two moms coming or two dads coming to the hockey rink or the soccer field and saying, I want equality and respectful environment for my children, from two gay moms. So there's all different angles that this is going to come at us from. But when it boils down to respecting differences. And we're good at sport at creating that team environment, so we just have to be a little bit more intentional right now until we get to the place where you don't need to use inclusive language because it's assumed. So I want to build on the second half of the conversation. We want to use Sochi as a platform because we're talking about athlete leadership, and so we're talking about Sochi, but we want to go beyond Sochi because Sochi was a platform, and the anti-gay legislation was a platform for more conversations, just like Brendan Burke coming out, and then Brian Burke talking about and being supportive around that. That was a platform for more conversations. Having the first openly, gay male chef or gay chef in the world through Mark Tewksbury, that was an opportunity. The fact that it wasn't an issue in and itself was something to talk about and celebrate. So I want to turn it over to Bruce to start out the conversation around Sochi, but more importantly, what that means in terms of athlete leadership for change over the longer term in making sport more inclusive.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you distinguished between the challenge of Sochi and the broader challenge of fighting homophobia and intersex phobia in sport and in society in other parts of the world. In that latter regard, I think we should keep our eyes on the Commonwealth because Canadians play a lead in the Commonwealth and in the Commonwealth Games. And in a federation where homophobia is rampant in a number of countries, I think we should keep this discussion going as we think about Glasgow in 2014. And because Toronto and Canada is hosting the 2015 Pan American, Para-Pan American Games, we need to keep this discussion going for the Americas. But for today, let's focus on Sochi. I strongly believe that the entire world, and particularly Canada, should hold the IOC to the expectation that Sochi in 2014 during the Games will be an Olympic city governed by Olympic values of inclusivity and the Olympic Charter, protected by the International Court of Arbitration through sport, rather than by Russian law. There is a long tradition of the Olympic city being a neutral city governed by Olympic values and rules, going back at least to the 1936 Olympics. That proved to be a telling moment because when the IOC showed up at the Winter Olympics of 1936 in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, because in those years, Winter and Summer Games were held in the same country, they saw that the entire city was plastered with anti-Semitic, virulent anti-Semitic posters. And the then president of the IOC, Count Belly Latour, summoned the head of the German state, Adolf Hitler, and said, dear Chancellor, please take these posters down or the games will not go on. Hitler, and this is documented in the IOC's history, responded, Mr. President, when you go to a friend's house, you do not ask how he runs that house or how he conducts himself in his own house. To which Belly Latour replied, Mr. Chancellor, that is not the case here. Germany and the German National Olympic Committee are hosting these games as trustees for the Olympic movement in the entire world, and we expect that during the games this will be an Olympic city. And again, I must tell you to take those posters down or the games will not go forward. Those posters came down. Complicated story about the impact upon German anti-Semitism after the games, but both of those games were held with the guarantee of full access to everyone, regardless of their identity and regardless of their allegiances. And I won't go through the long history, but that is the Olympic tradition, and we should hold Sochi and the IOC to that precedent. The second thing that I should mention here is Rule 50. Rule 50 prohibits political demonstrations during the games. And there's a long, complicated history around that. But to my read and to my sense of the history, it does not prohibit personal identification, including crucifixes and those kind of things, including headgear, including triangles, or other identifiers. And there's a long history of this. When Alwyn Morris won the gold medal in LA, he held up his grandfather's eagle feather on the victory podium as a way of affirming his identity as a member of a First Nation. There are many other examples of this. When Kathy Freeman, the amazing Aboriginal athlete from Australia, won the 400 meters in Sydney, she ran her victory lap with two flags, the Australian flag and the Aboriginal flag. And nobody objected to that. There was a Canadian Métis wrestler, I'm blanking on her name, who wore her Métis sash in the opening and closing ceremony. And. We should insist that those identifiers, that athletes who self-identify as whoever they are, do that without persecution. If they do not, we should insist that they be defended in the Olympic City at the International Court of Arbitration for Sport. One of the great protectors of athletes' rights, it's the international equivalent of the SDRCC, which is another one of your sponsors that your past chair, Laura Johnson, helped get established, which, as you know, is the tribunal that provides quick and expensive arbitration for disputes for national team athletes and other members. At the international level, the IOC at every Games creates, the CAS, or ECAS, creates an ad hoc division of 12 legal authorities from around the world who are on call on a 24/7 basis to hear appeals of decisions that would affect any athlete's rights and their right to compete. And they are required, if, for example, the COC or another NOC decides to kick an athlete off the team, or an IF decides, or there's a doping infraction or some other infraction, and that athlete decides to appeal, CAS will create a panel of 3 of those 12 legal authorities. And they must meet within 24 hours to hear that decision, and sooner if the competition is affected, and give an oral decision in 24 further hours and a written decision within 48 hours. And if you read those decisions over the last 20 years, most of them have gone in favor of athletes. The most famous Canadian decision is the decision that upheld Ross Rebliati's gold medal in Nagano when he was kicked out for the presence of marijuana traces in his testing sample when marijuana was not a prohibited substance on the list. I think we should also say, going into Sochi, that AthletesCAN and the COC will insist that if any action is taken under any IOC rule, but particularly Rule 50 on this issue, that Canada will be right there with the best legal authority we can provide in an appeal to the Court of Arbitration for Sport on the grounds that the Olympic movement stands for respect and inclusion for all, and the persecution of anybody on the basis of who they are is a total violation of the Olympic spirit and the letter of Olympic law.
And past president of the IOC, Bruce Jacques Roque, has said that sexual orientation he views as freedom from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, although not explicit in the IOC charter, he views it as under otherwise. So it's not one of the named ones. I'm so pleased to see that the IPC, the International Paralympic Committee, actually has sexual orientation in there as a form of discrimination that the Paralympic movement wants to be free of. And so it's explicit in there. And it's interesting. I want to do a couple things to segue. One is that right now everything in the media is around the Olympic Games. And one of the things that I want to share with you is the fact that there is a Paralympic Games going after, and you have Paralympic athletes who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, and intersex. And that's a conversation that doesn't often happen. And I know, so I want to bring that out. I want to name it. I want to talk about it. And we've been having discussions with Karen O'Neill, the new CEO of the Canadian Paralympic Committee, around doing more work around this issue so that we start to talk about it. And Danielle Peer is an out Paralympic basketball player, wheelchair basketball player. Due to health issues, is not able to travel, but she is an articulate spokespeople for athletes with a disability who are, also gay. So I want to bring that in to it as well. And I'd also like to talk a little bit in terms of Sochi, because what we're talking about there is an opportunity for change. And so the LGBTQ activists in Russia are saying, bring the games. And so when there were calls for a boycott, the boycott was, lots of different people were calling it for different reasons. But when you talk to the LGBTQ activists in Russia saying, no, we want the games to come. We want it to be a world stage for us to be able to, stage so that we can get these laws changed. And one of the things that I'm sure that athletes is uppermost in their mind, and I'd be interested in Chris and Lindsay's perspective is, we go in there for the games, but how can we sort of think about if everybody will have to make that decision about how they choose to approach that and on this issue and other issues and make that personal choice. But how can we affect longer term change, and so that we don't just go there, and nothing happens in Russia or nothing happens in my own sport. So maybe talk a little bit to Lindsay about how it feels about an athlete who's going into a country where being who you are is, may have some repercussions.
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer, sorry before you interrupt you. You want us to wait till the very end to ask questions, or are we able to ask questions as you go through the various presentations?
Can I, Lindsay and Chris, to speak and then take that question? Would that be okay? Perfect. Okay.
Great. So I had the honor or the privilege to meet a speed skater who's a Sochi-bound athlete, competed in 2010, and I had a chance to mentor her last year. She was going through a lot of struggles with her sexual orientation, and through one of her friends, she connected with me. And so I was able to help her prepare for the upcoming games, and she's decided to fully come out, and she chose the Calgary Pride Parade to be the day that she came out publicly, and she was featured in the Globe and Mail, I believe, Anastasia.
What's her name?
Buxus, yeah.
I saw that article, it's great.
It was an amazing day to be by her side. Her mom was also with her that day to support her, so what I think in Anastasia's mind is that she's doing it now so that she can then fully focus on the preparation for Sochi. Brilliant. In terms of timing, I think that was very wise, and I think she's going to have a heck of a games because of it as well. I also believe that, now that she has the full support of her teammates and her coaches, she is setting up this amazing framework to go into the village, into a country that's obviously very hostile towards gays and lesbians, and she's making sure that she'll be insulated by allies and positivity, and she's creating that atmosphere so that she can do exactly what she needs to do, and that's to represent Canada proudly and do her best. So it's going to take a lot of strategy, but she's going about it the right way, and I would think that what she's doing is probably happening amongst many athletes going in, given that there's a new added layer of, and this will bring out the activism in these athletes, and Chris, you mentioned that as well. It's going to come out, and it's how do you manage it? First and foremost, get that foundation, get your coaches and teammates to support it. Know that the COC is 100% behind you, and if at any time there's a change in the laws, if the Russian government will have any sort of ability to impose those laws, the COC will let those athletes know, this is the situation, you will be protected, and these are the avenues and what's available to you for that. So I think it's being managed, and athletes are being very smart going into this. Yeah.
Thank you. Chris?
Well, my perspective's a little bit different. I think I retired in '99, so it was a while ago. But I've been working on issues of identity in sport and from a different perspective in some of the work that I do. But about 6 or 7 weeks ago, I'll tell you, I co-authored an article with Ann Peel, who's the founding chair of AthletesCAN, who's sitting here. She and I authored an article because I felt that it was important when the Sochi stuff hit the news that there be a perspective from an out gay athlete that's out there, that's important, that talks about it, because a lot of the current contemporary athletes that are competing, their number one goal is to prepare for Sochi and to perform at their best. Ultimately, that's what every athlete wants. They don't want to necessarily be focused and distracted by that. We all have, we're all high performance athletes in some way here, so everybody wants to go and perform their best. Part of the reason I wrote that article was because of the push I was getting in the LGBT community. There's nothing like angry gays, right? They want you to stand up there and they're like, boycott, 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 wave the flag, put the pins on, get them arrested, we'll make a statement. And I said, no. I said, you don't understand. It is not the athlete's job that are competing there they don't go to the Olympics thinking to make a political statement. As out athletes, I don't want any athlete going to the games to do anything other than absolutely perform at their best. That's what their job is, and that's what their responsibility is. It's the responsibility of people like us and the people around them, the COC, and also everybody around it, to hold the IOC, the COC, and everybody to account. But that voice wasn't necessarily being heard at the time. So that's why Ann and I was driving her crazy, because I was like, she was on vacation. I'm like, I've got to get this out, I've got to get this out. And it was published in the Toronto Star, which I'm happy they did, and then they ran with it, and CBC ran with it, because they were saying, this is what we wanted to get, was the perspective of athletes, because it's not what everybody thinks. Because the gays wanted everybody to put a rainbow flag behind them and put a rainbow pin, and it was athletes that said, you know what, we're there to perform and to be at our best and hopefully win as many medals as we can, that kind of thing. And it's not necessarily our right as the gay community to put the expectation on anybody, gay, straight, or whatever, that they need to be an advocate in that game and put them at the games and put themselves at risk. Because ultimately that's what you're doing with all the controversy. Not only that, but look at the distraction to their performance. Blake Skellerup was on a panel with me, and he was talking about this. He's getting a lot of attention. He's the New Zealand speed skater that's training in Calgary, and he's getting a lot of attention about this because he's going to wear an Olympic pin, or I think a rainbow pin during the ceremonies, and saying, arrest me if you want to, I don't really care. which I support if that's his decision to make. But ultimately, I think it's the athletes that have the right to make that decision. And I think it's incumbent on everybody around those athletes. Particularly, I mean, I'm a summer sport athlete, so it's great for me. I can stand up and say, no, don't put the athletes in that position, because we want to make sure that they are in the best possible training and competition mode to compete at their best. And that's why I think it's important that there's a collective voice of athletes, because athletes are uniquely placed to be able to speak on this. Mark Tewksbury spoke about it. Greg Louganis spoke about it. There's athletes, Blake Skeller spoke about it. Johnny Weir came out and said, I married a Russian man, and I want to go to the games because the boycott stuff was just foolish because they don't work. 1980 proved that. They don't work. So why? And the only people they hurt really primarily are the athletes. Coaches sometimes get another kick at the can. They can come and coach for, but sometimes the athletes work their entire lives for that one chance at the games. And it doesn't hurt the organizing committee in a huge way. I don't know if you agree with me, Bruce, but you're smiling. But this, because it's a big issue, and I don't think that it's up to necessarily. And so ultimately, going back to that, the gay community was putting pressure, and I had to tell a bunch of friends saying, hey, you can't put that expectation on competing athletes to distract them and put themselves at risk and hurt their performance and training for that. That being said, the rest of us also have a responsibility to support those athletes there, because the laws are atrocious and the human rights abuses come out. And the Olympics is a stronger vehicle for changing that perspective by having those athletes there. But I can tell you, when I marched in the COC, the Pride Parade in Toronto with the COC, it was the first time they ever did it. Adam Vancouver did, Mark was there, Marnie McBean was there. We had a bunch of athletes, gay, straight, whatever, supporting, and it was a fundamental shift in terms of the way the COC looked at it. And it was good to finally feel like, I don't know if you felt this, but I often felt like I was 95% part of the team. Because I wasn't 100% part of the team, because I couldn't share that whole part of myself with the rest of the team, because they wanted to go to the bar and pick up girls. Obviously I didn't want to do that. But I never felt like I was completely part of that team, because I wasn't able to be open and be who I really was with them. Now it's a bit different, but I think that that's, in terms of the broader context of the sport community, that's where AthletesCAN is uniquely positioned to be able to be that support family, because this is bigger than LGBT. This is about athletes being who they are to absolutely achieve the best that they can for their country at the Olympics.
Yeah. And I want to segue to longer term change, because I think that there's a focus on Sochi, but we've got our own backyard in Canada here, where within our own sports, there's probably some things that we can be doing here leading up to it, and for longer term change. So one of the things that's happening internationally, and there is a lot of press on this, but everybody's getting asked about it. So you'll see lots of articles where, you know, Canadian athletes are being asked, what's your view on Sochi? How do you feel about going in and competing? Haley Wickenheiser, you know, hockey, the male hockey players, like everybody's getting asked about this issue. So if you come from a sport that's got athletes going to the Winter Games, again, Paralympics and Olympics, important that they're well informed, and that your NSO and AthletesCAN and COC and Canadian Paralympic Committee are doing that. But longer term change is being asked. So here's the catalyst for longer term change. So, you know, do we expect that those Russian laws will be changed? That would be wonderful if they are, over the longer term, hopefully. But the conversation that's happening now is about changing the way in which important sporting events around the world are given to countries where basic human rights, in this particular case, those who are LGBTQ, are either criminalized, and in 7 or 8 countries, the death penalty. So it's a shift. There's a hope that this is an opportunity to change that conversation and say, you know what, we should not be allowing countries where they, you know, kill people based on a basic human right around sexual orientation to host a major sporting event. And we should not be allowing countries to send teams, you know, those 7 or 8 countries, to the Commonwealth Games, to the Olympic Games. So they're trying to shift that conversation, and that's going to be a harder, longer conversation, but FIFA's in Russia in 2018. And, you know, and there's other countries as well. Russia's not the only one, and it's not the death penalty there, but it's a very oppressive environment where it's not safe to be LGBTQ, and now we have this propaganda law that says if you promote anything around homosexuality to a minor, you can be thrown in jail, fined, and deported if you're a non-Russian. So wearing a positive space pin, that could be viewed as Russian propaganda. So, and there is confusion around whether or not it's going to be a bias-free zone. Another element that they're looking at is in terms of saying, you know what, we need to have pride houses. So Pride House 2010, and there's no Pride House in Sochi, so now they're saying, well, you know what, we need to have a Pride House as part of the games, and that the IOC and the CPC, or the International Paralympic Committee, commit to that. So that dialogue is changing, and so that's really good. But what I want to do is, I want to have that time for a question, but I want us a little bit to reflect on what we can start to do and think about in terms of our own responsibility, in terms of are there things we could be doing, little steps in our own backyards in terms of making a difference and making sport more welcoming. But I want to give my friend Michael the opportunity to ask his question.
You're going to cross-examine us, aren't you?
No, just Bruce. Just Bruce, you're okay, Chris. No. Mike Smith, wrestling. Bruce, I was just trying to make sure I understood your point, or more so your recommendation. So is the recommendation to have the IOC rules apply in Sochi during the course of the games? Was that the recommendation?
Yeah, so give some teeth, some substance to past President Roga's undertaking that there will be no discrimination in Sochi. And so give some for instances, and make it clear that if an athlete or a credentialed coach or a ticket holder shows up with some kind of identifier of, and in this case, an LGBTIQ identifier, such as, fingernails with the rainbow triangle, as two Swedish high jumpers did in Moscow for the World Track and Field Championships, and were censured for that would be welcomed, that presentation of identity would not be considered offensive to the Olympic spirit, but part of the inclusion and the celebration of humanity.
So to suspend the law as it is during the course of the games?
Well, Rule 50 as it's drafted has not changed significantly over the last 20 or 30 years. The interpretation of it has been narrowed in a chill that I date from Beijing. Prior to Beijing, any kind of identifier, I gave the Kathy Freeman example, Chris's competitor, all of that was considered part of who athletes are and part of their identity and their incredible capacity. But in Beijing, as a result of all of those issues, the chill went into effect. And don't show, don't tell. And so that's where I think that the significant narrowing occurred. I'm urging the IOC to return to the pre-Beijing acceptance of self-identification. That's not the same as organizing a protest, marching down, or holding a demonstration in front of a venue. That's just simply saying, this is who I am. For the previous 40 years, that was quite acceptable. So I'm saying, let's return to that.
Okay.
Remember, and I wanted to slightly disagree with Chris here. The overarching purpose of the Olympic movement in its origins is not to make it to the podium or win a medal for your country, but to enable the world, despite its difference, to get together under the peaceful auspices of sport and culture, to get to know the differences that exist in the world.
I agree. I think the confusion for me is when you made a reference to CAS, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and them having that jurisdiction over what I thought you were talking about is the 400,000 people in Sochi and having the law of the IOC apply. I think that's where the confusion
my
was
guess
for me,
is
which
that
wasn't
from a
quite
legal
clear.
point of view, the only people who will have access to CAS are credentialed members. And I'm extending it, trying to push that envelope to ticket holders and others. But it may well be that if there is a test case, it will only be a credentialed athlete or a coach or official and so on.
Chris.
And maybe you'll be there to defend them.
Chris, alpine skiing. This, you may have sort of answered my question, but I sort of just wanted to restate it just because it's a little ambiguous. I'm famous for, I've been to 3 Paralympics now. I skip through the media first, pass them, and give my wife and my kids hugs and kisses after each race, then go back to the media. My fear would be that for LGBTIQ athletes not be able to show their loved ones affection in a PDA, public display of affection, and although the athletes might be protected, are their loved ones?
Really good question.
I think that's the fear of all. And I have that fear for people, even spectators, but in particular for athletes and their support network that goes there. I mean, I personally wouldn't be going to Sochi myself if I from that perspective, I just wouldn't want to go in that situation. Although, to clarify your point, Bruce, my perspective of being the athlete, I'm not suggesting that the Olympics is only to win a medal, but I am suggesting that that voice of that perspective of the Canadian athlete, or any athlete in general, about the right to, that's what the IOC talked about lately, right? Sport is a human right, and the Olympics are, in Anne's words, an earned right. You know, you've earned the right to go and to compete for your country. You should be able to do so free of discrimination and inclusion, and you should have the right to do so without any adverse pressure that's different on any one athlete versus another based on local laws, right?
So we have talked about a lot of different things in terms of possible little steps or bigger steps individuals or organizations can take. And so what we want to do is just spend the last couple of minutes in the group discussion that we have at the tables. And we've asked your buddy leaders to allow you some time to reflect and we're asking you to make a commitment. You don't have to share that. You can just, in terms of one little individual action you can take to make your sport more welcoming to those who are LGBTIQ. And I might just be saying to a teammate, hey there, I got your back in Sochi. You know, I know what you're going through, and if you need any help, you know, to something that, you know, maybe a bigger step. So it doesn't matter what it is, not for sharing, but just a commitment for athlete leadership. We'd also like you to then flip your AthletesCAN organizational leadership and give some suggestions to your table buddy who'll be taking notes in terms of some an action that you think or a role that AthletesCAN can play around making sport more welcoming over and above what it's already doing. So just take a couple of minutes on that, and then we'll come back and do a wrap. So back to you. And so our intent was for you to have that opportunity to talk about making that difference. And so if you haven't already made that commitment to do so sometime this weekend, and then to also talk to your about some actions AthletesCAN can take. And so I'd like you to do that if you haven't already done that. But we're at the end of our time, and one of the suggestions was, well, you know what would be really helpful is if you, in a few minutes, gave us some advice about how to support a teammate who is struggling with coming out. It's a very practical tool, conversation to have. So with your permission, what I'd like you to do is to continue to, over the next rest of the day, have that conversation about a personal commitment to yourself, and also offer your suggestions to your table facilitator about what athletes can. But with your permission, to ask Chris and Lindsay to spend the last couple of minutes of our session talking about that and talking to you about that. Would that be helpful? Okay.
Well, we were just talking up here saying, I was turning to Lindsay and to Bruce, and I said, wouldn't it be helpful if people knew how to deal with a teammate that was potentially coming out or that kind of thing? And sort of the golden rules of someone when you think someone's gay, because everybody knew I was gay, but it wasn't something that we could talk about. And I come from an experience where I wasn't in a welcoming, soft landing environment, as we called it. So there's a couple things that if you think a teammate's gay, one of the things is you never ask them outright. You never walk up and say, hey, are you gay? It sounds, I'm making a joke out of it, but it's quite serious. To come and approach someone that way, you can get a myriad of reactions, and it can be incredibly difficult. So one of those things is that you never ask somebody flat out if you're gay. And the second one is, kind of the golden rule in the gay world is you don't out anybody ever. Even if you know or suspect that someone is gay, that it's one of the few things, you just don't do it. It's every person has the right to make their own decision and their own judgment when it's appropriate for them, as everybody comes from a different circumstance. So I had teammates turn to me and say, oh my God, I knew 20 years ago. We were all like making bets when you were going to come out of the closet, but they still were respectful enough to understand that I had to work through the process until I was comfortable. So.
It is very much a personal journey, and first and foremost, we want to tell all of you that if you have any struggles with your own orientation, or you know of someone on your team who is, you come talk to us. We're here all weekend. We want to be those mentors for you, for the AthletesCAN family, and then allow you or those athletes whom you compete with to spread their wings and to take this dialogue outside of here. It's absolutely a personal journey. The key thing is to create that safe zone so that you use inclusive language. You ask if they have a significant other in their life. You can ask, or just allow them, they know that you're using that language so that you are an ally for them. And on their own terms, on their own clock, they know they can approach you. And the pressure will start to mount, and then, at some point you just sort of burst and you need to talk about it. They know that you will be their soft landing. So create that, nurture that, and they will start to open up to you, I guarantee it.
Because not every athlete wants to be out, not every athlete needs to be out. So, right. And that sort of inclusive, respectful thing means that if someone chooses to stay in the closet, that's still up to them, and they shouldn't feel pressured in any way to change that.
And maybe I'll just add that quite often an athlete who's coming out will ask the coach or the teammates that they first come out to, and in some cases the captains of the team, to help that individual come out to the rest of the team, and make that an easier process. And so you may be called upon as an ally in your leadership positions as athlete leaders to help with that process. And but and the other thing that I remember, and this is some advice to coaches, and it applies to athletes. If an athlete comes out to you, the first thing that you should do is thank them, because they have just placed an incredible amount of trust in you, and the trust that you won't share it, the trust that you won't use it against them, and the trust that you will still care for them like family. Yeah. Before that came out of their mouth. And so that's the first thing, and you should feel very honored and privileged that that person has trusted you that much. So, yeah. But so there's not a lot to it, but there is. And the only other thing I would add, and Lindsay added to it, is just we really have to get rid of that casual homophobic bantering. Okay, because oh, that's so gay, or
I say that all the time.
Yeah. So here's the deal. Everybody I talk to who's sort of older, they've been out for a while, or they've been at it for a while, they say, those words don't hurt me. I'm kind of used to it. but I worry about the 17-year-old junior coming through. You know, so remember that when we're talking about that. And you know what? You don't have to do it in a, you know, it's just sort of, you know, hey, you know what? I'm not sure that's a good term we should be using. You know, it's not very respectful, or, you know. So you don't have to, and you don't have to call them out in front, or her in front of your teammates. You can do it, you know, very confidentially. But you gotta, and the coach sets the tone. I know that. So we're doing some work with coaches too. But I think athletes, we can play that leadership role as well. I want to, yes, sorry. I know Jasmine is hoping to, but.
Hi there, Jeff Payne, Skeleton Commission Board, whatever. Just putting on my old high performance director hat and my current performance coach hat, and along the lines of something that was set up there, is make sure that you guys as athletes go back to your NSOs and ask them about their plans for this issue in their Olympic preparation plans. Because if they don't have a plan, you need to ask them to make a plan, and if that NSO doesn't exist or they're dysfunctional or whatever, make sure you have your own plan, much like media plans, all that kind of stuff, because it can be very distracting for performance potentially, and you don't want that to happen. So that's just my little bit of soapbox advice. Thank you.
Yeah, some sports too, like I come from a sport of children, right? I started competing at the age of 5 years old, and then the girls are 14, 16. So I mean, it's a different game sometimes when you hear that sort of terminology in my you know, throughout my entire 15 years of formative whatever, versus people that are adults when they do their sport. So it is, your language is really key, I think. Your language.
Well, and on that note, there is work being done. So in terms of education around the issue, so AthletesCAN is doing more work on this issue, and COC and CPC are working on this, as is Coaches of Canada. So there's work being done. There is information out there, and so, but absolutely, we need to go back to our NSOs and say, you know, what are you doing on this? And Cause is very involved and able to help out. So I'm going to turn it back to Eric, because we've been taking up your break time. So
Great. First of all, I'd like to have a Ryan. Okay. First of all, I'd like to give a huge round of applause to both Chris and Lindsay. God, I get like choked up sometimes. It hasn't happened yet at this forum, but you know, I think I'm gonna actually get through it. You know, it's interesting. You know, we talked about sports in diving. I've had a gay coach, a gay roommate, gay teammates, and I find actually this is a really special environment to be able to speak very openly about that. And I think, you know, it's you know, ironically, I think this happening in Russia is actually really a good thing. I think it's in the grand scheme of things, it's going to bring this to the forefront, and will ultimately be a big step forward in sport. As we're talking at our table, you know, what can AthletesCAN do about it? I mean, Jazz and Tom have worked and drafted a statement by AthletesCAN that we will issue in collaboration with other sport partners, and I think that'd be something good to share with the group here, perhaps tomorrow, or we'll find some time to do that. Sorry? It's in the Dropbox folder, but I'd like to, you know, we'll speak about it specifically. Another idea that came about at our table was that, you know, with the change in the Not-for-Profit Act, adoption by 2014, effectively every NSO is changing their bylaws. And, you know, one of the things that we could look at is publishing an addendum to all bylaws that have some sort of language of inclusion or some specific policy around LGBTIQ.
It goes on forever. It's LGBTQTTG. Like, it goes on because the gays can't decide what they want. Right?
You know, and I think it could be a really big statement. You know, we talked about as athletes using inclusive language, and you know, it's a really big influence that we can have going back to the athletes, and not just a one-off. Hey, we had this incredible session and panel talking about this issue, but actually just our behavior, I think, is really key. But you know, putting that language into the bylaws of every NSO and MSO in the country, I think it's a unique timing with this change in the bylaws and could be interesting to look at. So I think that's a takeaway for us.
Very briefly on that note, we had the idea of adding it to your athlete agreement. About to be cleaned up by Pat's dragon. Of adding it to your athlete agreement. adding it to your athlete agreement, and thus that there's a safe environment to train in. Have that be part of the NSO's responsibility.
Good suggestions.
Super. Jess? So the next session, we have a break now for 10 to 15 minutes. We are going to be hearing from STRCC and Sports Solution following up our break. And we'll 10 minutes, so 10 after 3. And we have some gifts to thank you all for your time and your contribution here this afternoon.